That's a name that might be familiar to My Tiny Bottles followers. Hello and welcome to My Tiny Bottles, the project where I'm exploring my grandmother's legacy of miniature liquor bottles, one tiny bottle at a time. I'm your host, Tammy Coxon. In my episode about Bottle 86, Luxusova Vodka, I talked about how even when a brand name has a long history, that doesn't mean what we can buy today has very much in common with older bottles. This is very much the case with Bottle 92, Gibson's Finest, a 12-year-old Canadian whiskey. When it comes to whiskey, the Gibson name dates all the way back to 1856, when a man named John Gibson started making whiskey at his Gibsonton Mills distillery on the Monongahela River in Pennsylvania. That location is important because Old Monongahela Rye has legendary status in American whiskey circles. This is the whiskey that was made by frontier distillers fighting against taxation in what's known as the Whiskey Rebellion. Rye whiskey from this region of Pennsylvania was the first American whiskey to become famous around the country and the world. It was so famous that it's mentioned by name in Moby Dick, where its color is compared to blood. That drove the spigot out of him, cried Stubb. 'Tis July's immortal 4th, all fountains must run wine today. Would now it were old Orleans whiskey, or old Ohio, or unspeakable old Monongahela. The color reference is important here because one of the things that made plain Monongahela rye into Old Monongahela is that it was aged, at a time when aging in whiskey was not universal. This no doubt contributed to its reputation for quality and its popularity. There were several makers of Old Monongahela, but few survive today, even in name. Old Overholt is the best known one, although these days it's made in Kentucky and no longer has the historic mash bill of just rye and barley, no corn at all. The other name that still survives is the one on this bottle, Gibsons. By the early 1900s, the Gibsons Distilling Company was the largest distiller of rye whiskey in North America. But then, Prohibition happened. As I talk about a lot in my cocktail classes, Eastern distilleries were especially impacted by Prohibition because the land was more valuable. A Kentucky bourbon distillery could close the doors and hope to wait out Prohibition, but that just wasn't feasible for East Coast rye distilleries like Gibson's. The distillery itself was sold off and the liquor stocks were bought up by the newly formed Cincinnati Distributing Corp., which was one of the companies the U.S. government designated to sell medicinal whiskey. And the man at the head of that company was Louis Rosenstiel. That's a name that might be familiar to My Tiny Bottles followers because he would go on to found Shenley Industries in 1933. Shenley was one of the so-called Big Four liquor companies that dominated the industry in the U.S. for most of the 20th century. At the time Shenley was created, it owned a lot of brand names it had purchased from failed distilleries, and it got to work using them. Although most articles state they didn't resurrect Gibson until the 1970s in Canada, there are actually vintage bottles of Gibson's blended whiskey from the 1930s and 40s available online. They're labeled as bottled in Alladin, Pennsylvania, which is where Shenley built a blending, rectifying, and bottling house in 1933. But Gibson's true resurrection didn't come until later. In 1945, Shenley purchased the Valleyfield Distillery in Quebec and established its Canadian Shenley Limited subsidiary. And that was where Shenley's ownership of all those old American whiskey names would truly pay off, as they began to be reintroduced as brands of Canadian whiskey. Golden Wedding was one of the first in 1948. OFC Canadian whiskey was released in 1954. In the pre-Prohibition U.S., those initials stood for Old Fire Copper, but they eventually became redefined as Old Fine Canadian. While these brands were targeted at the Canadian market, the Valleyfield Distillery was also making whiskey that was exported back into the U.S. and sold as bourbon. The borders and definitions were a lot more porous then, and Canada actually had a thriving bourbon industry. It's kind of ironic that the man who benefited so much from it, Louis Rosenstiel, was also instrumental in shutting it down. That's because he was the driving force behind the 1964 resolution that made bourbon a distinctive product of the United States. Why? Because by then, it was better for his bottom line. In 1972, Shenley Canada started selling Gibsons as a Canadian whiskey. But as I talked about in Bottle 48, Noblesse, the whiskey in question was Gibson's 909, which was only aged for 6 years, not 12. Noblesse, at 10 years old, was the premium whiskey in their lineup at the time, but seems to have disappeared around 1975. Presumably freeing up those older whiskey stocks paved the way for 12-year-old Gibson's Finest to be released, which happened in 1979. I spent a long time trying to put a date on this bottle. Some old bottles of Gibson's Finest, like mine, list 3 locations: Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver. Others just list Montreal. I am not going to bore you with all the details of the various mergers and acquisitions involved in untangling that. As best as I can tell, this bottle is from the 1980s, and I can't get much more specific than that. Because of its connection to my Noblesse bottle, this has the potential to be a really interesting side-by-side comparison, but with one interesting hiccup. I can't be 100% sure that what's in this tiny bottle is actually Gordon's Finest from the 1980s. Because unlike every other bottle of Grandma's so far, this one looks like it might have been opened. At least the little ring that breaks off the cap when you open it has already broken off. So maybe that will make it an even more interesting comparison, since the Valleyfield distillery is known for having some very distinct flavor notes, and it will be interesting to see if we find them in both bottles. Do you know the perfect person to help me with that comparison? Drop a comment below or at mytinybottles.com or on social media. You'll find me at TammyLC on Blue Sky and at mytinybottles on Instagram and Facebook. And please like, subscribe, and share. Cheers!